Chair of our committee, our continuing ed committee, to explain what's going to happen now.
Yes. Welcome, everyone. There are some of you who've been here a lot over the past 2 days, which is wonderful. Thank you. And some people who are just here for the first time. Thank you for that as well. This is the fourth and final presentation of our Beth Scholar in Residence Weekend. And I want to say it has been really a pleasure to learn with you. Your insights have been provocative and challenging, and I mean that in the most positive sense. And on a personal note, you will always be the teacher that made me, that made tax law fascinating and something that I want to work more closely at. And if you want to know more about that, you're going to have to watch. If you weren't here this afternoon, it blew my mind. All of these are being, is this being videotaped too? Oh, good. Okay. Well, we weren't using mics, and so I thought.
Oh, so because those hear everything you say.
That sounds scary. And I also appreciate, as everybody knows, this is the year of aesthetic for Beth and I really appreciate that you have really brought in the theme of personal responsibility to everything that you've been teaching about this weekend. I appreciate it. So the final talk tonight is actually a conversation. How American cities made and remade Jewish politics. It's in conversation with our beloved Rabbi Berg. And now I have to switch so I get this right. Rabbi Berg and some of you who don't know yet, this is Dr. Lila Corwin Berman, who holds the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University, where she directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. Her talk this afternoon drew concepts from her most recent book, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution. And she's also the author of a book that she's going to draw from tonight, which is called Metropolitan Jews, Politics, Race, and Religion in Post-War Detroit. And I think you two can explain more how you're going to play this out. So enjoy.
So our plan for tonight is that I am going to present sort of a thesis in 4 parts, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit, and I'll draw a little bit on some of the research I've done about Detroit, and we'll think about the relationship of some of that to your community here. So really the goal for tonight is to bring some of the themes and ideas that we've been discussing over these last 2 days, over the Shabbat, really close and personal to the experiences of your congregation and your community. And I do want to say, because I think I don't feel as if I have expressed this enough, the incredible gratitude I feel for this community, for inviting me to come and be a guest at your Shabbos tables, multiple meals, multiple times, and it's really just been a delight to get to know this community. I have to say, when I talked to my husband, I said, if we lived in Baltimore, that's where we'd go. And I haven't said that about every community I have visited, although they're each special and wonderful. But I really appreciate the work that the adult ed or continuing ed committee put into this. So the thesis for tonight is that American Jewish politics is, or perhaps was, urban politics. And I'm going to set out the terms of this thesis, and then we'll have a conversation. So why am I saying that American Jewish politics are fundamentally urban? I have 4 points. The first is that when we think about Jewish politics, I think we need to think about their spatial rootedness. They arise in general, and this is a way to sort of understand what we mean by Jewish politics, they arise, I would argue, in the deliberations and contestations over how Jews occupy space. There is a feminist geographer whose work I think is really important. Her name is Doreen Massey. And she argues that places are not simply areas on maps, but they are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time, right? So places are these constantly shifting articulations of relationships. And the articulations of social relationships that have tended to bring Jews into contact with non-Jewish power structures have determined things that I think are really core to what we mean when we talk about Jewish politics. Where can Jews live? Where can they move? Where can they travel? How have non-Jewish authorities surveilled and disciplined and extracted power, capital, resources from Jews and from Jewish spaces? So the first point that I would argue is that we need to think about Jewish politics as spatially rooted, that space matters to politics, and to politics particularly of Jews. So point two, if you're following me, that Jewish politics are spatially rooted, modern Jewish politics are rooted to the spaces where most modern Jews have lived, which are overwhelmingly cities in the modern period. So we could make this as just a basic demographic case. From the 1880s to the 1930s, the global Jewish population became almost entirely urban. So all sorts of historical geographers and demographers have done this work to show that this is not surprising, right? It was connected to the spectacular growth of cities through industrialization and through different forms of economic transformation. And not only was this the case globally, but it was certainly the case in the United States. But we could also make the case for the ways in which modern Jewish politics are rooted to the space of the city, not only as a demographic case, but as a kind of rhetorical, discursive case, that more than most others, in the modern period, Jews are associated with the urban, with the cosmopolitan. And that association lashes together a kind of ambivalence or anxiety about cities and Jews, and an excitement about cities and about the kind of cosmopolitan nature of all the different groups that can occupy them. And the kind of dual-faced nature of urbanism and of Jewish urbanism reflects a kind of chaotic space of the city, that it's a place where masses could mingle in ways that they had not been able to in pre-modern spaces. It's a space where there's the possibility for a kind of anonymity that sanctioned various forms of experimentation, and where traditions and authorities could be challenged. So the kinds of ways in which cities offered possibilities of diversity, of experimentation, of pushing back against tradition or authority were both the kinds of hallmark achievements of modernity, but also raised anxieties. And raised anxieties in particular about the groups most associated with them, and Jews were among the groups most associated with them. So the third point is that the political pressures and opportunities, that kind of ambivalence, those two sides, that delimited urban life in the modern era, and in particular in the United States, alighted on American Jews and delimited their ideas about power and its distribution. So one way that political theorists define what politics is that it's a conversation about power and its distribution. And in the United States, the ways in which cities offered both opportunities and possibilities for Jews, but also sort of delimited those possibilities, that became core to how Jews, I would argue, in the United States thought about power and thought about its distribution. And these had to do with the laws and policies that drew maps of urban space, drew those kinds of social articulations, apportioned resources and opportunities in often very unequal ways. And it had to do with the sort of persistent tension between urbanism as an incredible connector, and we can think about the public spaces in cities where people who would have never had a chance to be proximate to each other are together in a park or on a street corner or in, a public school. But cities are also some of the most stark dividers, right? And the laws and policies put into place to sort of govern the maps of cities have not only connected people but have segregated people. And the final point is, therefore, because American Jewish politics were rooted to urban space and urban policies, the transformations the cities experienced from the mid-20th century to the present reconfigured Jewish politics, right? So as cities went, so went Jewish politics in a way. But obviously there was also more of a sort of dialogical, a kind of exchange, because Jews became so central and core to the fabric of cities. So in a sense, a piece that I'm really interested in, and this is where I think I want to see if we can begin a conversation, is that even as one of the most important transformations in American urban life and in American Jewish life occurred in the second half of the 20th century, which was Jews leaving cities, right? Which was on the kind of broader urban scale, resources and power leaving cities. Even as that happened, because American Jewish life was so shaped by these kinds of fundamental forces of modern cities, I would argue that the city has remained politically percussive in American Jewish life, but as a space often of remove, to be mourned, to be repaired, to be profited from. And when Jews leave cities after World War II, and this is something I have found in research I did, they tended to equate their moves with the kind of fall or decline of urbanism. And in some cases, that meant that they've drawn real kind of politically active scrutiny to the laws and policies that disinvested in cities. But it's also created a kind of hollowed out image of cities, as if because Jews left them, because white Americans left them, they either froze in time or declined. And when Daniel and I were talking about this conversation, Daniel noted that sometimes he has experienced a certain suburban nostalgia for American cities, that a community, a family that once had a presence in a city will come back and not see the city as it is, but sort of imagine what it was, and then have this sort of narrative of, what has happened since we've left. So this is a community I've learned that is really proud of remaining in the city and being rooted in a city neighborhood, that lots and lots of people who are like the people in your congregation left, and lots of businesses left, and lots of institutions and communities left. And so I'm really interested to hear how this sort of idea of American Jewish politics being rooted in cities and the movement away from cities, how that plays in a synagogue where that movement, although maybe for some of the congregants, but it certainly didn't happen for the institution.
Yeah, it's great. And when when we started thinking about who we might bring as a scholar in residence, your name is one that's been kind of in the back of my mind for years, really, because I have read some of what you've written over the years about urbanization and cosmopolitanism and where Jews fit into that story, both in terms of white and Jewish flight, but also in terms of gentrification and what it's meant to reclaim cities. Look, so I'm not a scholar, I'm just a pulpit rabbi, so any claim I make is not going to be a claim as a sociologist or historian or anything like that. It's going to be more rooted in my own personal experiences, and I like to read some books as well. But one of the books I like to read is Mishnah, and so before we even get to America, I think about what is the source material that informs what we do, right? So I often will kind of do this exercise, or I have at least over the years done this exercise on a number of occasions with folks who are committed to social justice work, Jewish folks, and I'll ask them to think about a time when they were involved in a particular political moment, right? An action, a protest, a campaign of some kind, and I'll ask them then to think about, in that political moment, what was the source material? What was the text? who was the thinker, what were the values that informed your reaction to that moment, or the fact that you're holding on to that moment. And oftentimes people struggle to come up with answers to those questions, and so I would contend that in some ways, like the urban or the maybe urbane kind of political sensibilities that Jews have is rooted in a historical consciousness that we have, but we're not really always able to articulate. So one text that comes to mind is from Pirkei Avot, where there's this discussion about people who claim something belonging to you or belonging to somebody else. So I won't go through the whole thing, but the one that I'm thinking of is you say, shalach, shalach, shali, shali, right? What's yours is yours, what's mine is mine, right? And there are others, it's like people say, what's yours is mine, no good next, right? But what's mine is yours, maybe they're a little too giving. But what's yours is yours, what's mine is mine. You would think, okay, fine, that's okay, right? Each of us have our own possessions. And they say two things about this. First, they say this is a position of that's Benoni, right? Sort of a middling position. And the second one is midat stone, right? This is like sodomite behavior. This is this is what went wrong at the quintessentially evil places in the world. We read the story of Noach today, right? So that happened with the world, but this happened with these cities that were destroyed. And what was so bad about them is that everybody sort of kept to themselves, right? That everybody sort of assumed that they couldn't occupy shared space. So I think for me, a lot of the success in trying to concretize maybe that collective memory of the Jewish people in the work that we do in the place that we are is rooted in the sense of we already got from our sources this idea that we're all created in the image of God, that we're all reflections of the divine in the world, that there's value in being proximate to other human beings. And so in some ways I think urban settings activates a kind of almost genetic Jewish disposition, right? And I mean spiritually genetic Jewish disposition to wanting to encounter, right? And I think that is in this natural tension with our tribalism, which is real, right? But I do think there's a reason why, Jews threw off their kapatas with vigor at the Enlightenment. It wasn't just finally they love us. I think part of it's that, but I think part of it is always I don't think we do all that well in severe isolation, and I think we kind of get that at a fundamental level because all of our best stories are about sort of encounter in various ways.
It's interesting. So when I was working on this book about Detroit, one of the questions I had, I chose to write about Detroit because Detroit in the general U.S. urban history literature is the poster child for white flight, right? So it was a city that was predominantly white, and then suddenly there's this sort of white ring, some people say white noose, around a city that is predominantly black. And it happens very quickly, and it's been used to show in the literature that when white ethnic people moved out of cities, they tended to move to embrace very conservative politics, right? So there's this whole literature about it. And so I was sort of asking, well, how does this play out for Jews who move out of cities and don't necessarily embrace those same conservative politics if we just even look at electoral patterns, right? But one of the things I started to sort of dig into was when did synagogues make the decision to leave, right? And what I found, which really speaks to what you were just saying, is there was so much anguish about leaving, and it wasn't just, oh, but we love this building, and oh, but my grandfather helped build it, and whatever. It was actually that, we don't know what it would be like to be Jewish with so much space, right? And one of the really striking things is, even as there's this sort of anguish of, what will it mean not to be in these more dense neighborhoods? And Detroit is not, it's a city of homeowners. So people, it's not Manhattan, right? But there was real neighborhood culture, and people were close to each other, and they really worried about losing that. And what's so interesting to me is even as they articulated that worry, and it's in the board minutes and it's everywhere, they then built these suburban campuses that were so sprawling right? That like, there was big road, no sidewalks, huge lawns. You had to call them campuses, right? It was like massive parking lots, and like so it was both, that we don't know what it's gonna feel like not to be in this close kind of environment, but if we're gonna do it, we're all in.
Who's the British rabbi who said Jews are just like everybody else, but more so? I wonder if we like went to the suburbs and we're like, if we're gonna do it, we're gonna do it, right?
Right, and like, so that's, and you can look at the architecture. I have not been to enough, suburban Baltimore synagogues to know, but in Detroit, it is an architecture that is just like, you feel lost in it, kind of, right? These big modernist buildings, and it was of the moment, right? But investing so much money, so many resources in like trying it out. Like, okay, what is it like if the synagogue steps are not going to just seamlessly bleed into the sidewalk? Like, you look at the architecture of your synagogue, and I know now you enter on this side, but it was built because people would enter right from the street, and when you left, where you would chit-chat was on the street, where other people would be going by and seeing and hear these Jewish people on the street doing their thing, and that's what they do. And you have these campuses, no one's going to see it, right? It's just an interesting thing that happens in that.
It is, and we're at some point we also want to get like other folks to weigh in and ask questions and give your own experiences as well. I think one of the things that I wrestle with a lot is, what does it mean to bear witness to this nexus of history and geography that is this neighborhood and the synagogue in this neighborhood, right? We just dive into this beautiful new courtyard, which used to be an alley, right? But I have older congregants here at Beth Am who remember that alley from the times when they were growing up in this neighborhood here in the early 20th century, right? That alley has a name. It's called Jordan Street. And if you talk to, I don't know, Betty Seidel, right? Betty Seidel remembers living on Utah Place and going up and down Jordan Street, and like, what did we do? We like cordoned off a section of this, what just felt like an alley to us. At the end of it, it's not like a major thoroughfare, but like we did something permanent to that in order to create that space. I feel mostly good about that. But I also, when I think about like the rich history of this neighborhood, one of the advantages and I think one of the challenges of being the synagogue that stayed, right, and what it means to be in, for, and of this community is, this isn't like a typical gentrification story, right, where it's simply like, folks who have white skin privilege moving into a neighborhood that maybe was predominantly black, and there's, displacement and quick kind of increase of home values, and Starbucks moves in and whatever else, right? So, but it's fraught, right? Because in some ways we occupy our own land, right? This is very much ours, at least when they allowed Jews to move in, right? There was a time when this area was the Mount Royal district, and it was without Jews, without people of color, were not allowed at all, and Jews lived, in other places, and then Jews, as you well know, were sort of allowed, as Jews became maybe more accepted as white, were able to sort of buy homes from white folks and sell them to African Americans, and so that dance happened very much right here at Utah Place, where Utah was Jewish, but Madison and McCullough, certainly to the west, were exclusively black, and this was the area where, when, I don't know, was this Supreme Court in maybe 1917, when they started opening up or changing segregation rules, that now they didn't have these laws on the books anymore where if you lived in an all black, what's that?
The restrictive covenants in a Kramer.
No, just before. I mean, before covenants. I mean, like de jure, like you could have a black block and not sell to a white. You weren't allowed to sell to a white family, and vice versa. Right? Covenants, of course, came in and did exactly the same thing. Right? So that's very much a story. So I guess maybe a question I want to ask to you is, in your research in Detroit, or in your sort of thinking about Jews' political sensibilities, cosmopolitanism, what does it mean for a community that that are not interlopers, right? That are not carpetbaggers. These are like, this is our neighborhood, right? It's been our neighborhood for a long time. We didn't, but in the sense, like, we're also in a way kind of reclaiming our sense of being here too, right? And while our goal, certainly not our Beth Am school, is not to create a Jewish neighborhood of old, right, where it is an almost exclusively Jewish neighborhood. As we think about like a new Jewish neighborhood, a neighborhood that's defined by Jewish values lived, and values that aren't only about tribalism but are also about inclusion or shared values like education and collective thriving. What kinds of things do we need to be conscious of in this work to make sure that we're not simply remaking some of the problems of 20th century migratory patterns back here, right?
Yeah, I think it's a really, first of all, it's so important you're asking it, right? And you're sort of thinking about those historical patterns. And I think that can already do a lot. But like one of the things that I noticed in Detroit, so I would assume much like Baltimore, the kind of Jewish neighborhoods of Detroit moved over time, right? So it wasn't like their first, place that Jews lived and then they moved to the suburbs. But Jews in Detroit had lived very close to the center of the city, and then as they, gained more socioeconomic power, they moved to larger apartments, larger homes, and eventually to nicer, more middle-class neighborhoods, neighborhoods that had newer housing stock, and they became sort of aware of these patterns that would happen. And like on one hand, this was part of, and this speaks to something you were saying before, like this was part of the Americanization effort. They wanted those patterns. Like they saw mobility and migratory power as part of what it meant to be a really full-fledged citizen. Like, yeah, we can move to all sorts of spaces, and as we accrue more assets and we accrue more power, we'll move to places where we can have, more money invested in our housing, and we can, live in more beautiful places or whatever. So it was like a value also to move in a certain way. But they became aware of the ways in which it was also sometimes undermining some of the stability and just ability to thrive of their communities to be moving like this so much. And they became aware that there were losses in those movements, right? And so you do have people who start to say, well, are we going to be moving every 10 or 15 or 20 years? Like, should we even be investing in buildings? And what is the point of this? But I think that what seems to me, and like hindsight is 2020, right? Like I think people were operating in the midst of so many different pressures in the 50s and 60s, and when they decide to move to the suburbs, and they're making decisions for their families and for what they think is going to be best for them. But I think that there wasn't a sort of sense of what the larger structural rules and practices were that they were operating in, that despite their best efforts, like so in Detroit there are all sorts of Jewish organizations sort of under the umbrella of the Jewish Community Council to stop quote-unquote neighborhood change, to endorse open occupancy laws, to stop the redlining and blockbusting practices of real estate agents. Like they were aware that there were these forces that were making it hard for them to stay in the neighborhood, but they weren't really aware that like this was a part of a kind of constellation of much broader political and economic policies, and that most of the time they were kind of focused on the individual, like let's have a cleanup drive, let's teach newcomers how to maintain their homes. But they weren't really realizing, for example, that the newcomers who were buying property, who were Black Americans in Detroit, were not having the same access to financing. So when they weren't maintaining their homes, it was literally because they had so many more of their assets sunk into their homes.
They also paid a premium to
They
get them
paid
in
a
the
huge
first place.
premium, and their homes could be garnished from them until the very last payment was made on these kinds of, they were called land contracts that they would tend to buy in. So I think that insofar as one can both be aware of fostering those individual relationships, but always thinking about like what are the largest structures that are operating here, like what are the zoning policies, what are the banks doing, 2008, what was the subprime crisis, what does that have to say about what was going on here? Because what I saw historically in Detroit is like people tried really hard. There's a point they really wanted, many Jews really wanted in a genuine way to stay in the city and believe that they could have an integrated neighborhood. And they were like flummoxed. Why isn't this happening? And I think it was that they were operating at a sort of like, street level and maybe a couple floors up, but there was not really that sense of these larger structures. And that's hard to do, and I know it's hard for one community to do, but I think insofar as you can keep your eye at those sort of larger structural forces and think about how they're going to impinge upon any other kinds of efforts you're doing, you have a better shot of not just sort of replicating those patterns.
I think of a conversation I had. I used to work in Chicago at a big urban shul there, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who sent his kids to a blue ribbon public school. And the school was not always a blue ribbon public school. The way it became that is a group of, white and Asian American, upwardly mobile or more affluent families decided that they really didn't want to pay private school tuition, and so they were going to get together and invest in the school. And they approached the administration and they said, we want to help you rebuild the school from the failing school that it is into a successful school, and that's going to be mutually beneficial for the school and for our families, right? All that sounds fine, right?
Yes.
So, great, we're going to work with you, and it's going to start in kindergarten and then go to first grade, and sure enough, that is exactly what happened, and now the school really is an excellent school, and all of the Black and Latino kids, for the most part, who were at that school, right, and their families, are no longer able to go to that school because they've been priced out of the neighborhood and are no longer zoned into that school. And so one of the questions that I wrestle with a lot, and I feel sometimes that we at Beth Am and certain others, but limited voices kind of shouting prophetically into the wind of like, what do we need to do now so that 20 years from now, 50 years from now, as certain things improve in the neighborhood, things that everybody wants, right? Better schools and cleaner streets and safer neighborhoods and greener parks and all that kind of stuff, right? That generally people all agree on. What kinds of policies, practices, but also values, like how do we want to walk through our neighborhood and in a way that that forestalls that sort of zero-sum success, right? And I don't know if is there anything you've encountered in your research that you feel, and others feel free to weigh in as well, that might kind of point us in that toward like actual answers to some of those really tough questions of like how can we as an effective anchor institution in this neighborhood work toward a neighborhood which is going to be diverse, right, racially, religiously, socioeconomically diverse for maybe generations to come in a city that kind of like packaged eugenics and exported it to the rest of the country. So we know how to do that. We just don't know how to do this, and I want to do this, not that, right?
Right. Well, I can somewhat answer that question in a question for you, but I think that there's something about actually learning and harnessing the language to articulate the value of why it's so important to be in this kind of community. And something we had been talking about before, and this is a question for you and for the congregation, I think, is part of the value of this community being in this space, in this urban neighborhood, is clearly a sort of sense of responsibility, a sense that like we want to help make this a thriving, good space, a good city. It was a space where lots of Jews found success and found happiness and thought was a good place to be. And we want to do that, and we want to do it for the cause of justice in this city, and that's really like something we want to give in a way. And I think that that's part of the value, part of the motivation. But I also have a sense, and so this is like an observation but a question, that there's also a sort of feeling that the best, most sort of vibrant, meaningful American Judaism is the kind that can happen in this sort of space. that in fact, even if we took all of us and we just moved us to a suburban campus somewhere or some other kind of, very, very gentrified space, our Judaism wouldn't be like as good, as meaningful. So there's like an inside value about that. And that's something that's like really interesting to me, because there's an external sort of political sense of responsibility, and then there's a sense of like, actually, this gives this community something of its vibrancy, of its vitality, of its Jewish meaning. And so there's something that we're taking, but maybe it doesn't have to be seen as a sort of extractive or a problematic taking. Maybe it is about actually saying like, hey, we don't just think we're here to sort of like giving justice to all of you out there, but let us tell you what we get, what we feel from being in this community, why you are so valuable to what we do, even when you're not in our sanctuary with us, right? So that's, like, I wonder if my read on that makes any sense, if there's a sense that, like, this is the way to do it.
I'd like to get some folks, and we have a number of people who have been members of this congregation for a long time. Maybe you live in the city, maybe you don't. My rule is always you can live in the county, you just have to feel a little guilty about it. But I'm sort of like, we're here for a reason. There are also a number of people who live in this community, in Reservoir Hill and Bolton Hill, across the tracks in Remington or wherever, and I'm kind of curious if people want to reflect on your own choices. Like, what about Beth Am, aside from your love of Rabbi Dratch or whatever else, right? But what about this synagogue sort of appeals to you? Maybe drew you to this shul or drew you to this neighborhood, and does it feel like it fits with Lila's sort of assertions about Judaism and cosmopolitanism? Yeah, please.
Hi,
we can just kind of make it conversational tonight, I think.
So, I'm originally from Chicago, from the city, and grew up in a neighborhood that was, when we moved in 1960, it was still probably about 60% Jewish, but the Jews were moving out to Skokie and elsewhere, and a variety of people were coming in. There were still shuls in Albany Park. And there was a lot of nostalgia in my family, in my immediate family, who chose to stay in the city because they grew up on the west side of Chicago, which was really the Brooklyn of Chicago, with all the institutions and all that stuff. So when we moved here, we moved to Mount Washington, which is, leafy like Mount Airy kind of former suburb from the city, which is still a little country for my tastes then, and we were, our realtor, Marianne Sucklow, belonged here then, so that she thinks we'll really like it here. We came and it was the old chapel, and there were the old Alta Kakarim of the choir, these old guys, and it was exactly what you said. For me, I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, for me coming into this shul, in this neighborhood, in this kind of building, with those kind of people, that was the most Jewish I felt in a long time, compared to, the 20 years in the meantime. So I think I've inherited that nostalgia for the West Side that I never lived on. That's just, for me, that's very powerful, and I don't know if that's organic or that's just my family, but for sure, I relate to that 100%.
Yeah, I think I thought Carla's hand first, maybe. So Carla, and then Robin and David. Yeah.
So I grew up with a different perspective in the city, with a family both involved in urban politics and urban stuff, and the daughter of an immigrant from Nazi Germany who was a border crosser, what I call a border crosser, and a good teacher of the complexity of this stuff. So my perspective for you is that the way in which Baltimore is a unique, somewhat, not unique, but unusual city. So it has, it's either it's got the charm of the north and the efficiency of the south. It both had segregation and got rid of it faster and better than most other places in the south, but still had problems. And similarly, the lines of the politics in Baltimore, the space of things, what is Baltimore City, what is Baltimore County, that they're not in each other in terms of political power. And the fact that the Jewish community itself straddled the border in its last iterations, so that the area that is northwest Baltimore City and Pikesville itself, on both sides of that talking about the sense of space, how that changes the sensibility. Among what it meant is that the Jewish leadership in Baltimore hung on to its buildings in the city, their institutions, longer, and while making a separate new one out, they kept the one within the city. Then you can add an extra layer, which is that the Orthodox community, because of the walkability, chose to straddle that border, and that maintains those institutions. So then you can add another layer of the internal Jewish politics between the Orthodox community and everybody else of us. Whatever you want to call the liberal community, etc. So I'm aware that whether that's too much of a level of subtlety or not, I don't know, but it means that you talk to people who haven't been outside of Baltimore, they have a different point of view than people who moved away and came back.
I want to just throw into the mix just an observation based on something Carla said. So the Jewish Federation of Baltimore has actually recently decided to sell its property in the city, right? So now they have their, in Park Heights, which is part of the city, right? They're gonna move there, so they'll still be within the city limits. But their kind of major building in Mount Vernon next to University of Baltimore, they're selling that campus and they're moving to what is, I think, very much more part of the kind of ghetto of the Pikesville, Park Heights area, right? And so I just I'm reflecting on like that choice, especially given
Baltimore moving by 10 minutes means you're moving mentality.
moving
Everywhere
mentalities,
else,
right?
The
Right.
notion that driving 10 minutes.
And how
Well,
far
15
that's
minutes
like
is a
that
long
shift
way.
from 7 years ago after Freddie Gray, when the feeling at the moment was, how can we as the organized Jewish community redouble our efforts to invest in urban Baltimore and Black Baltimore and stand as allies, and different choices are being made. Now I don't want to sort of ascribe to that I'm not willing to make the claim that I know exactly why they're doing that and what other forces are involved in that choice, but it does send a message, and I will say it feels like an interesting choice in this moment. There were some other hands and folks. I think Robin wanted to say something, and David, and then maybe Rachel. Yeah.
So I want to piggyback a little bit on what Steve said. I am not from the city, of any city. I'm not even from Baltimore. But I did grow up in a suburban synagogue. And when you were talking about the big sprawling campuses and things like that, I hated where I went to synagogue growing up. I mean, it's not so much the rabbis or any of that business, but it wasn't a welcoming place. And when we came to Beth Am, it was completely welcoming. And, the chapel that, being with the Beth Am people was amazing, but also we park our car, we walk through the neighborhood, and we say hi to whoever is there on the way to shul. Jewish, not Jewish, whatever. That's a great way to start a Shabbat morning, when you feel like you're really interacting with community members, whether they're part of your strict community or just around. And that's a wonderful thing, and we've been here for 17 years.
They joined a month before I was born.
So I said David, and then Rachel. Yeah, and then Bonnie.
Well, so like all your other talks this weekend, this has been fascinating, and I have a bunch of disorganized thoughts occurring in reaction to what you've both been talking about. So let me start with a question, and then I'll try to also respond to what you asked, Daniel. The question I have is, I have what maybe is a completely ignorant and simplistic sense of the history of Jews in this country that makes me, so my impression is that the history of immigration to this country, say from the second half of the 19th century on, is mostly immigrants coming to urban areas. community, and so on and so forth. And if that's right, which I frankly have no idea if that's right, then Jews as a largely immigrant community in America would seem to be following that same pattern. And so if that's true, how does that interact with what you're talking about tonight? And then another thing that occurs to me is whether, and again, I don't know if I'm right in my history about this, but if the immigrant, how much of this is driven by whether the immigrant Jews were allowed to own land and be agrarian and farmers where they were coming from. And my sense, maybe wrong, is that they largely weren't for reasons of discrimination. And so, and specifically wanting to dispossess Jews of their land and being rooted and so on and so forth. And so how much does that fit in and be an explanation of Jewish urbanism? And then I also wonder about like the centrality of, I mean, in Orthodox Judaism, right, the idea that you would only walk to the synagogue. And the centrality of community to Judaism as a religion, and how much that can exist in rural areas. It's not impossible, but seems more difficult, especially without capital initially. So I'm curious about how all of that fits in with what you're talking about. And then one observation, or one other question I had is about the Orthodox community seems like an exception to what you've been talking about the 20th century move of Jews to the suburbs. My sense is that with what's the name of the town? Right. In New York, there's been some attempt to like recreate, you know, a completely separate Jewish existence outside of the city, but with that exception, it remains completely rooted in urban areas. So I'll shut up with all of that.
So I think we could have a semester-long conversation, and your history is generally right, and I think your observations are all really valuable. Two things I'll say. One is, it's absolutely the case that other immigrant groups who came, especially post-1880, tended to move to cities in the United States, and this was because that's where jobs were, and this was a period of industrialization and factory labor and all of this stuff. So there are lots of elements of this that are not unique to Jews, and you know, I think that some of the kinds of political transformations that happen to other sort of white ethnic immigrant groups happen to Jews in the same way because of, you know, the different kinds of opportunities and policies of cities. But one of the puzzles for me has been to try to figure out, like, why does that trajectory of embracing conservative, at least electoral politics, not map onto Jews in the way that it mapped onto other white ethnics who left cities. And I think it did have something to do with this sense of sort of what the cosmopolitanism of the city was and what the value of that was and what it meant. But the other observation about Orthodox communities, especially like Crown Heights or Kiryas Yoel or whatever it might be, you know, we're talking about cities as places where, you know, people connect across differences. But I said that one of the other features of cities is that they have drawn some of the starkest lines, right? And it's sometimes just a street, right? Or it's an overpass of a highway or whatever it might be. And, you know, as Jews were leaving cities in the 60s, the Rebbe actually says, right, to his flock, do not leave, right? This is actually sort of an order that's promulgated. And his concern is that if they leave this sort of density of the city, it will kind of unleash too much experimentation, too many opportunities, and that the community has a lot that is sunk into the space of, Crown Heights mainly, right, which is where, there's other communities as well. But even when they do leave the city, so Cure-SUL is a different kind of sect, and it's a different settlement. There's a tension between being really very insular and using space as a way to draw a very stark division between, Haredi Orthodoxy, or Lubavitch, or Satmar, whatever it is, and anything else. But one of the most fascinating pieces is how those communities also participate in benefiting from and or at least trying to draw benefit from the structures, the laws, the policies of the urban environments that they're living in. And there's been some really wonderful work about kind of real estate policy and how, right, so there's a lot of ways in which communities that appear to be living in cities in insular ways, and I think ultra-Orthodox in this country are sort of like the prime example of that, are actually very embedded in the politics of those cities. And the last thing I'll say is that despite 501c3 laws, Lubavitcher rabbis, the Satmar rabbis will get up and tell their congregants who to vote for, right? And that is just a very clear indication that they are very aware that no matter how insular it seems that their community is, there are kinds of policies and laws that if they are changed would adversely affect their community, right? So it shows a sort of interactivity.
But that's what I think it was tonight, it might have been earlier, where you were saying that that's what it takes, is to be involved in this bigger structure. So really,
Total awareness.
they're doing the right thing, but it's got a little bit
There's
of
a mindfulness
twist.
that's required, and a sort of willingness to look at it in that way, and not in the sort of identity politics or the or instrumentalizing. Rachel was waiting, and then I think Bonnie, and then whoever else wants to go next. Yeah.
I was just going to respond to what you were saying about the Federation leaving their Mount Vernon location, because I have a slightly different take on it. I'm not from Baltimore. I've been here for 23 years. I spent a lot of that time working for the Jewish community, a good amount of it under the Federation. And in my memory, the only interaction that the Federation has ever had with the neighborhood they live in is artscape. And I think anything they said or did after Freddie Gray was stemmed from political correctness. I don't think there was ever any actual real feeling behind we need to do something, we need to change. So while disappointing, I actually think in some ways their move out of Mount Vernon is one of the most honest things they've done. Because they're not invested in the neighborhood, they're not invested, they could have been an anchor in that neighborhood. And they certainly, again, come out in force in artscape. But for me, it was sort of similar. I think we got to the same conclusion, sort of the nail in the coffin of thinking that there was any sort of focus on the city.
Yeah.
That was my reaction to.
I mean, I think it's fair. Look, I mean, there's probably a reason why in 12 years of being a rabbi at Beth Am Synagogue, not once has anyone from the Associated come to me and said, would you like a sign? Right? Like you go to all the other synagogues in the county and they have these We're Associated signs. To my knowledge, no one's ever, I'm so glad that they don't, but I keep wondering, like, when's the other shoe gonna drop? When are they gonna say, hey Beth Am, we hear you're doing some good stuff there, we'd love for you to put up a We're Associated sign so that you are connected with and I think they would just think of it as like probably diminishing returns. Like why waste the money on a sign in Shore Hill, right? Like it's not, that's not their target audience. Yeah. I think Bonnie was waiting. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask the question about why we came one place versus the other. I grew up in Forest Park and going to the old Beth and Beth left, and the community left, and then we moved to another place, which was still going
can I ask you a question about, so you mentioned, I don't, was it Roy Oldenburg, is this concept of like third places, right, parks and cafes
right.
and just, you know, and certainly that's what, in many ways, it draws me to want to live in a city, is to be close to other people and to, you know, for my kids to be able to sit on the stoop and see neighbors and meet people in the park. And but I wonder, like, what's the role of arts, culture, learning? When you think about like Jewish political sensibilities in cities, right? It seems to me that Jews also gravitate to civil society kinds of things, and they want, you know, the theater subscription, and they want to be able to, you know, go to, you know, the library and the whatever else, and have it all kind of available. And I wonder, do you feel like that's a piece where obviously those things are available in exurban settings, but not in the same density and not in the same way, perhaps, and maybe not at the same level, right? That I mean, I remember going as a kid from Chicago out to far-flung suburbs to the Marriott, where they would have this theater in the round, and they put on some pretty good shows, right? But it wasn't what you saw at the auditorium, or, you know, or at Looking Glass Theater, or the stuff that you get downtown, right?
Right,
So,
right. Well, I think that so whether it's Lefebvre or Soja or other people who talk about these sort of third spaces, like a space that's not, you know, a private space, and it's not just like a totally open space, but it's like a quasi-governed kind of public space, but where strangers can sort of be together. I think that, you know, aside from whatever we might say about Jews' interest in learning or high culture or the arts or whatever, I actually think there's something about being in the spaces that allow you to just sort of like be part of the masses experiencing something. And so I think that there's a way in which, whether it's going to the theater or going to an art exhibit or being in a public park or whatever, like the way in which one could, and you didn't have to leave your Jewishness necessarily to do those things, but you could participate in a kind of civic experience, an arts and culture experience that wasn't like assigning you to any particular group. Like it was a way of sort of like being part of a kind of broader community that's all now partaking in this play, or is all looking at this exhibit, or is all listening to this lecture. And you know, an irony is that in many cities, when Jews would go to the theater or go to an exhibit, they were often going with an audience that was predominantly Jewish, right? Depending on, you know, certainly if you think about New York City and the way that the theater worked there, you know, there were times when that audience wasn't actually this sort of broad diversity of people, but there was a way in which that kind of cultural act, that kind of participation, was exactly the kind of like stuff of the third space, feeling like you could participate in something that just as a human being, right? Just as a person. And yet getting so much sort of consciousness of like who you were particularly from those experiences and whatever. So I think that it's it's not to say that Jews value arts and culture more than other groups, but I think that when someone was coming from an experience of, in most contexts, being always sort of perceived as marked as being Jewish, to be in a space where that was not what the situation was, where you're interacting with somebody with, you know, with something, with a whole audience of people, that could be sort of like a real liberating kind of experience.
Yeah, just speak, fine. Whoever wants to.
Really quick question. In the 1960s, the race riots were a watershed event for American history. I'd be curious what you thought the influence was on Jewish identification and a sense of community, and as well as obviously
Yeah, so one thing that was interesting when I started studying
Let
Detroit.
me just, because I'm not sure that the folks at home could hear the question. So, so Alan's asking about race riots and sort of the impact on the Jewish community. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, so part of the narrative, you know, kind of had always been like, yes, these really difficult uprisings happened, and you know, there was destruction of property, and it really felt unsafe, and that was sort of like really a reason that Jews left cities, that other white people left cities. Now, the chronology is just not right? Like the kind of larger laws and policies and structures that were already disinvesting in cities, that were making it so that suburbs were very attractive to and economically exciting to various white people who lived in cities, predated any of those 1960s riots or uprisings, right? So it was always like an interesting kind of question about that chronology. And clearly, Detroit is 1967, right, when there are these uprisings. Like that really did feel like when you talk to people from Detroit, like that there was a line drawn then, that like things at this point had just fallen so far away from the city that they knew. There's a story I remember encountering a guy named Max Fisher, who's a very prominent Detroiter, who made his money through oil and gas and then real estate, and who had left the city years before '67. He hears about the riots and he says to his driver, he's very wealthy, bring me to one of my office buildings, one of my holdings in the city. And he goes and he stands up and he's looking out at fires, because there are a lot of fires, and he says, what has happened to my city? Right? And like that sort of like ex post facto claim, and he still had investments in the city, right? He owned a lot of real estate. Becomes sort of part of the narrative of like, even if Jewish families or white families had left prior, that this becomes almost a turning point, even though it's after the decision was made. And I think just in terms of how narratives are told and how memory works, I think it's very interesting.
And I also wonder how much it becomes an excuse, right? So we're sort of reading into, in the same way that like Sophie Carmichael becomes sort of blamed for the breakdown of African American, Jewish American relations.
Right.
Maybe there's more to that story than just saying, well, it's Black Power is the reason because they didn't appreciate our involvement in the civil rights. Like maybe there was more to the story than that. I think I see maybe Margot and Katie. Yeah, please.
I was going to say something else, but I to that effect, like I think that we also, as a Jewish community, highly overstate our solidarity with Black Americans, particularly around the 1960s. I can remember my mom saying, shortly before she died, she was like, oh yes, like in my community growing up, people were like, oh, Dr. King, he was a troublemaker, right? Like she was honest about the fact that like, no, the majority of white Jews were not pro-Black in the 1960s. But to the question of like why Vietnam, I mean, I grew up in one of these big suburban shuls, and I think that one of the things that was so uncomfortable about it is it was so mired in a culture that just didn't feel very Jewish, right? Like it didn't align with, reading Isaac Bashevis Singer and like having this density of bustling life in the shtetl, and then you're going to this giant campus where everybody else is Jewish, and you're only there for like doing Jewish things, and you go back to your house in your car, right? Like it didn't feel like culturally what I thought Judaism was through like every medium of what Judaism was, apart from my lived experience of being a Jewish child growing up in the suburbs. And then like moved to Pittsburgh, where you've got this, where the Jews never left the city, and you've got this like very dense Jewish community that does have that feeling of like, this is Yiddishkeit, as like I have imagined it, and then finding out that I was going to be moving to Baltimore when my husband matched here for residency, well, the first thing that I did was like looked at a map, like went to the Associated website and was like, okay, well, let's figure this out. And like Bethlehem was like, whoa, I didn't expect to see a shul this part, like in the city. And That shows the country with me.
I do want to make like one observation about that sort of 60s moment and like how much solidarity there was, and obviously it's like incredibly complicated, but in Detroit, so I talked about these uprisings in '67, and one thing that is really striking to me is that so many Jews had left a decade before, and yet one of the things that the Jewish communities that live in the suburbs of Detroit did is they immediately set up these things and they have such a funny name. They're called like suburban access centers, and they actually were like, we're going to bring some of the resources of our suburbs into places in the city where communities are suffering because there were so many fires, there's so much property destruction, and we're going to just go give stuff, and whether it's medical care or it's food or it's money. And these were like people who had also left the city, who had profited sometimes from selling their homes to black families who paid a lot of money for real estate that should not have been valued that high, right? And they're going into the city, and it was unforced, right? They didn't have to. This is very complicated, you know, like, so having one or the other sort of way of describing it never quite captures the kind of complexity of what those connections might have meant at any given time.
Katie, you were waiting, and then we'll come to Mr. Wait, Katie was going to say something, but then Mr. Aldubi. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking of your talk last night and your emphasis on sort of dismantling these complicating golden land narratives, but it feels like our conversation tonight has reproduced one of those stories, which is the idea of sort of upward economic mobility as a universal experience, universal 20th century American Jewish experience. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what you know or what you've seen about poor and working class Jews in the mid-20th century.
Right, so one thing that we know about poor and working class Jews in the 20th century is that they tended not to be able to move as frequently or quickly, right? And so there's a really important book about Jews and Italians in New York City and communities that don't leave, not because they don't want to, but they can't, right? They are working class communities who can't leave, and part of what they do is they sort of castigate, especially the Jews, you know, these sort of, Jewish liberals who say what you should, you know, believe in, and, you know, diversity and kumbaya and whatever, and of course not in their backyards, right? And they're leaving, and so they can say, I believe in X, Y, and Z when it comes to social programs or whatever, because they're not actually walking the walk. They're not staying in the cities, and that one of the really interesting things is that whereas Jews who left cities after World War II tended to present in a kind of liberal profile, Jews who stayed in cities actually, by and large, tended to present in a much more conservative profile and voted, you know, if we just do this by electoral politics, like they voted for Nixon, right? Much more than Jews.
Like working class white people.
Yes, yes. And so that is this interesting, now, you know, look, demographically, it's not a huge population of Jews who fall into that category, but it's also an overlooked population, and it again adds this sort of complexity to the narrative of what the politics of staying in the city might have meant. Because they say, we're living in this city, we don't want these kinds of policies that are, you know, pro-civil rights agenda and this and that. You know, we want what a more conservative politics is offering.
When you talk about the people who are the liberals in the suburbs, when they spoke to each other about this, they said, what are we going to do about our city, our cities? The person who owned property, a lot of property in Detroit said, what's happened to my city? And there's a big difference between how they think about the city. One is talking in terms of something's got to be done. We've got to do something about this. The other is saying they're ruining my city. And there's a whole melt of, you know, right there and then. And there's no Yiddishkeit there.
In the suburbs.
Yeah. Okay? Because I can see this congregation from what, and I'm only a visitor, but I've been visiting for many, many years. I can see this congregation all of a sudden saying, for instance, to some of its teenagers, or maybe some volunteers, let's set up a tutoring service for the neighborhood. Any parent that wants to send the kids here after school, we'll have some of our high schoolers or our junior high schools help them. That's community. And that's seeing yourself part of the community. I know that the synagogue right here is involved in many, many things in the neighborhood. But it's things like that that take us out of the ghetto mood, that make us part of the city.
Yeah, and one of the things that's been really important to me, and I know to others, is that, you know, the walls of this building really are more like semi-permeable membranes, right? That we want the space to be available. In some ways, COVID was cruel, among other things, because it made it difficult to activate this new renovation as an anchor and gathering space for our neighborhood. There used to be community meetings happening in here all the time, and educational things and concerts, and it's, you know, we're starting to get back to some of that stuff. We've got our Party at the Polls coming up, but it's been a little hard to kind of get back to the level of activity that we had before, and you know, also getting beyond the building, going out into our neighborhood, that it's not just about service projects and volunteerism, but it's really about community building and relationship making.
Yeah.
The hour's getting a little late, so I want to be mindful of time. Is there anyone who wanted to say something who didn't have a chance to do so? Yeah, so let's take maybe 2 more comments, and then I don't know if you have any sort of final thoughts. Yeah.
I don't think, I'm a little bit concerned that we, like, treat suburban Judaism as, like, not authentic. Like, you know, I grew up in the city, but, I grew up going to Physic, and I went to school there. And so I basically spent, like, years 0 to 14 on, like, a huge suburban, like, synagogue, school, mega plex. Yeah, and, like, was it, like, what did the Messiah come in that place? No, but it was like it's, you know, it's this place that, you know, and do I go to Physical now? No. But it is the place I spent that time, and it's a, you know, I remember being like a magical big
Right, far
place.
more American Jews had that
So,
experience.
yeah, so I guess,
It's not known, it's at that dividing line, it's walkable to go to some place.
sure, yeah, I mean, but I guess, I don't know.
Farmers in
But like demonizing the kind of suburban.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, I
Yeah.
don't know, I feel like my dad grew up going to synagogue here, and I had a funny experience at Rosh Hashanah when I brought my son. He was 1, and I was like, Dad, I guess my son was here like you were here when you were 1. He was like, oh, actually, no, we didn't, like, join until we were like 7 or 8, and I was like, wait, so this, like, golden era when you guys, like, lived in this neighborhood and went to the synagogue was, like, 7 years long? Like, I mean, like, so I guess I just worry that we lose something by treating these decades in the suburbs like it wasn't real or authentic when it's, you know, it wasn't perfect, but it was what it was, and it for better or worse, it's our history. So
I think that that's an incredibly important point to make, actually, and that, you know, it wasn't like that was necessarily the errant path to take or anything like that, and in fact, you know, it may be that there are certain ways of doing Judaism in those spaces that end up also being really, like, generative and important for Judaism, and also having certain kinds of, like, political valences to them and political importance. So I think that that's a really key point to me.
Dan Richmond, you were going to say something?
These are just a couple of thoughts that have been running around my mind, and I don't want to speak for the Orthodox, but I wonder if we factor out the Orthodox, or factor out everybody other than the Orthodox, how that changes, if at all, some of the dynamics. For instance, Baltimore, I guess, has been a great increase in the size of the city in the Jewish community, but
Well, I think what you're speaking to sort of broadly is actually, the real complexity of what happens in cities. And then I think the prior comment as well, even the sort of complexity of defining what is and isn't a city space, right? Like, so for example, in Detroit, one of the suburbs that lots and lots of Jews move to is a suburb called Southfield. And now Southfield is an area that is, I think, on the last census was 70 or 80% Black. It has lots of diversity in it. It has an absolutely sort of thriving scene. If you like go to the public school, the different kinds of people, and you have new immigrants, and you have people who've lived in Detroit a long time, and people are new. Like, to what extent does the word suburb that one might sort of think of necessarily fit what's going on there, right? So these categories are really in flux at different times, I think. And I think, even talking about like what do the Orthodox, what is the experience of the Orthodox with cities, or how does that change the way that Jews inhabit cities? Like that category even of the Orthodox, right? We would have to sort of unpack what that means. So, there's a lot of complexity when you kind of delve into it. So I think that these comments both kind of help remind us, not to just paint things with broad brushstrokes.
So I wanna just, one final note. I've been thinking a lot about your presentations over the course of this Shabbat and this weekend, and I don't know if there's one through line, but one idea that kept coming up for me that's somewhat related to your question of Noah and blamelessness and blame, right? And I think you took great pains throughout the weekend not to assign blame and apportion blame in various ways along that journey. I don't know if the word is agency or what, but I that for me is a real takeaway, is thinking not about like who are we pointing fingers at for how we got, here or there, right? Whether it's anti-Semitism or it's the challenges and problems of the philanthropic industrial complex or whatever else we're sort of exploring. But I do think like you have challenged me to think about like what is our role, what can be done, and what sort of responsibility do we need to claim for the society that we want to be a part of or that we want to build. And it's something, I wrestle with a lot. I've been one who's been on record saying, very firmly that, Jews are never responsible for anti-Semitism. And I believe that, right? I don't think that black folks are responsible for anti-black racism. I think that's the haters who are responsible for it. And anti-Semites are responsible for anti-Semitism. And yet, right, like, the question of agency and the question of not just like realpolitik, like what's pragmatic, but the question of like what can be done is something that looms large for me. And when I think about our community in the city in 2022, in this moment in time, the best that I can offer is that to really be mindful of the history, right? That the more that we can understand our history and the history of this country and the history of urban civilization and migratory patterns of Baltimore and how that relates to other cities or not, when we can be more informed about those stories, we hopefully can avoid some of the pitfalls that perhaps previous generations or our generation fell into. So I'm really grateful for the historic lens that you've brought this weekend. I want to thank you for helping launch us on our year of tzedek. And I also want to give a shout out to Susanna Kolstad, who really did an extraordinary job this weekend. Alex is away for a family simcha, and that's great, and he's where he should be, but it was a pretty heavy lift for Susanna, and I feel like the weekend went exceedingly well, in large part because of our scholar, Dr. Berman, but in no small measure because of the work that you, Susanna, and our staff and volunteers did to make all of this happen. So thanks to you for your efforts as well. And and thanks for coming this evening. Shavuot Tov.